social sciences, or even what we considered biological sciences at one point historically, were created to justify racism, right? Like we forget that part of that history. Science was used, scholarship was used to justify slavery. Science and all these things were used to justify these differentiations that we created in society. If you look at the work of Edward Said in Orientalism, that was his entire point. He said, look, Orientalism was a study to maintain colonialism.
We saw that you had your PhD in, what was it, Middle Eastern Studies? Can you tell us exactly?
It's really Middle Eastern, like modern Middle Eastern history. It's so funny when you tell people you're a historian because they'll start asking about any period, any place in the world. And I'm like, that's kind of infinite information. So we tend to focus on fields and not just anything that happened at any given time in human history. So mostly focused on contemporary Middle East, and my research is focused on contemporary Iran, especially post-revolutionary Iran. So I wanted essentially like a historical background, a historical backdrop to understanding the current state of affairs and history. I was a psych and cognitive science major in undergrad. But I got very interested in Middle Eastern studies courses. And this is because I went to undergrad, right when I started undergrad, when the second intifada was happening in Palestine. A year later, you had 9/11, 1 year after that, not even 1 year after that, several months later, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the year after that, the invasion of Iraq. So my undergraduate experience really formed around these events. And that's why I got interested in those courses. And to my mind, and a lot of political science majors are going to get upset, or international relations majors are going to get upset when I say this, but to my mind, history was the most holistic way of understanding actually where we are today. Like it was less of an academic endeavor and more of trying to really get at how did we end up where we ended up. And it's a shame that it is one of the subjects that is least liked for people to study or understand, because kind of important to know.
Hold on. Are you trying to say that you can get a better understanding of how the world works today by looking at history than by finding some data set that's available somewhere and running some multiple regression analyses on it? Really? Wow, that's hard to understand.
It's fine because I know that you're disdain for the social sciences, and so I can say this is a safe space for me, so I can say those things. No, I mean,
it's not disdain, it's love.
Every discipline offers its own, its own analysis and contributes to the overall study. For me, it was hard to understand still why we're in this current state without all that background. And it always became, it becomes sort of a where do you start type of a thing. So when I say I study contemporary Middle East, I still had to study the entirety of the history of Islam. And then that always went back to, well, you should probably understand Christianity. And then, well, you got to understand Judaism and how, so it becomes this study of understanding every layer of how you got to where you are. But what was the meme you once sent me, Peter? It was something like, people who study history are
doomed to watch those who don't study repeat it, something like that.
Exactly. Exactly. And yes, that's how it is.
Yeah. I like that, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a bit of the same critique that I have of social psychology. That's my background, so it's pretty similar to you. And I don't know if probably not. But recently, less than a year ago, maybe around a year ago, I published a paper in Perspectives on Psychological Science on how our science makes a very big mistake by really ignoring like larger social historical contexts of societies when trying to explain behavior. So we run a data set, of some behavior, and we say, oh, this person behaves like that person behaves like that, without ever questioning the deeper sociological reasons behind where does that behavior actually come from. That's such a big problem of our social sciences.
Well, that, and so again, if you look at this context that we sort of came of age in, a lot of it had to do with the war on terror. And so there's tons of research on the notion of terrorism. Why are there terrorists, right? Like there's so much research and literature on it. One of the problems is exactly what you're saying, is it's then easy to draw conclusions that don't necessarily reflect this larger history. And so people will jump to a conclusion saying, oh, well, I guess Islam is just a religion of violence. And it's like, well, it was around for 1400 years though. So remember, all of that time before, you don't see the same phenomenon. And that's why it becomes so reductionist to just take take a small space and just understand the phenomenon there. I still think that is important in our overall understanding, but like I said, it's the more disciplines, and this is why, like in contemporary academia, multidisciplinary approaches are gaining traction, because that's the only way to really understand it, And it's like, instead of sort of competing to see who is right, it's more like, well, if there's a problem and we're all trying to sort of find the same resolution to it, then it's contributing and cooperating into how we can study that thing. And funny enough, you can use that exact logic for the entire global community and how we do things.
Yeah, but I think you're kind of downplaying the importance of having a data set where you have a dichotomous variable of Muslim or not, and then you have a freedom score that's numeric, and then you look for a correlation, and if you find one, like, well, Islam causes unfreedom.
Correct.
Exactly. And that is the problem with our sciences, is that, and probably you can relate to that, Assal, is that in a way, by not questioning these things, it's purely supporting the status quo. And that's why we often call this a hegemonic science. It's a Western hegemonic science. We don't question these deeper intentions behind, for example, the conflicts in the Middle East. We just study, okay, there's more terrorism centered or organized in these areas in the Middle East compared to terrorism anywhere else. And we say, you see, the tendency of Muslims in that part of the world is more strongly skewed towards terrorism than anywhere else. While nobody ever asked, like, okay, but what happened the decades or hundreds of years before that it's such a mess or a chaos over there, and by not questioning these things, it's just simply you indirectly really are supporting the status quo. And to just get back to what you just said, Assal, is that I had the same frustration. Like 9/11 was for me a kind of a wake-up call. Before that, life was just idealistic and good, and I didn't really care about all these intergroup relations. But with a father from Algeria, of course, and 9/11 happening, my whole reality changed, like how people spoke of people that come from my father's country, and how people speak about Muslims and so forth. And what I saw is that what you exactly say, and the same happened in the Netherlands, I think the same happened all over the West, is that all these, like, the things that happened in the Middle East was all explained away with reasons such as, okay, but Islam is against our freedom. These people are inherently dogmatic, and they attack us because they hate our freedoms, which is so ridiculous. If you at least know, some other human beings from maybe any Muslim country, and that just triggered me so much until today. Until today, we're still having that discussion. What do you think about that?
There's so many assumptions that go into that, right? Indonesia is a Muslim country. It's the biggest Muslim country in the world. Malaysia is a Muslim country. You're never talking about those countries when you're talking about Muslim countries. There's 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, right? So to take that many people and try to categorize them and sort of paint them with one brush is obviously problematic from its outset. But there's also, you're raising the question of the academy itself, right? Like, we're all scholars, whatnot. And we've been through that process. And that's why actually people who have been through that process are the ones who are supposed to be questioning its integrity the most, right? In the same way that a journalist should be questioning the integrity of another journalist. Like, right. You should be holding your peers more accountable than other people holding your peers accountable. And the reason is because there's an entire history. You're pointing to the fact that social sciences or even what we considered biological sciences at one point historically, were created to justify racism, right? Like we forget that part of that history. Science was used, scholarship was used to justify slavery. Science and all these things were used to justify these differentiations that we created in society. If you look at the work of Edward Said in Orientalism, that was his entire point. He said, look, Orientalism was a study to maintain colonialism. You look at the work of, I believe it's Max Weinreich, who did a study just a few years after the Holocaust and looked at, and his study is called Hitler's Professors. And what is the point of that? It's to say that Nazi Germany wasn't just a political structure through like a bureaucracy, but was actually supported through, again, the academy. So the same, we ask questions today about, there's people getting dissertations, getting PhDs talking about the question of terrorism, the question of Islam. Well, there were people getting PhDs back in, the 1930s in Germany on the Jewish question. And so we just assume that in the present period that we exist in, everything is now pure and we're doing everything great, like one of the phrases I hate more than anything is when people say post-colonial. I'm like, when did it end?
Yeah, right.
Like it didn't end for us to be in a post-colonial era. So these are the things that we should be challenging within the academy. And I remember when I had students, that was the main thing. It was like, don't listen to what I'm saying because I'm saying it. Don't listen to what your professors are saying. Examine it yourself. And through that examination, figure out, where there's room for you to actually draw conclusions and formulate your own sort of opinions on it. The problem is there's a sort of laziness that's not fair. Maybe I shouldn't say laziness because obviously we do this as a profession. But while we have access to so much information, the problem is we don't have access to how to interpret that information. We just have a bunch of information, right? Like I can explain Schrodinger's cat to you because I can Google it and read a Wikipedia article about it. It doesn't mean I understand physics. It doesn't mean I understand the math. It doesn't really mean I understand what I'm saying. I can just repeat it to you. So there is a difference between having access to information and being able to digest that information and make sense of it. And that's the part that we're missing, I think.
I think it's somewhat similar to what you were saying before about people asking you, tell me about Mesopotamian history, or tell me about the history of the human colonization of the Americas 10,000 years ago. It's a similar sort of thing. And the realm of history is so large, you could spend the rest of your life studying as much as you could and never get anywhere near 1% of all knowledge out there. Well, that's what people face when they're facing the political world. They have access to unprecedented amounts of information, but how do you choose what information to delve into? And then when you have that ignorance, then your interpretation of the rest of the world can get as absurd as we see a lot already in the real world. So, whether you're talking about does Islam just inherently produce terrorism? Well, if you don't know any history and you're just looking at the world and the only pieces of information you have are, oh, I see on the news all the time Muslim terrorists. Oh, okay, well then it makes sense. There seems to be some sort of link there if you know nothing else. It works the same with economic policy. You'll see people say like, oh, look at Cuba. The US is so rich and free and wonderful, but Cuba is not as rich. So it must be their economic system that's inferior, as if there's no such thing as history that put Cuba into a given state of economic development. And the US was at a very different state of economic development. Its relationships with the rest of the world, its claims on resources were totally different. So ignorance can really produce some amazing opinions, like they hate us for our freedom. That